and welcome to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies, a podcast where our international fellows discuss the most pressing issues of today that we're all facing and share their exciting research ideas. We hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you for tuning in. Good afternoon and welcome to the International House. I'm Ksenia Chmutina, I'm director of the IS, and it's really nice to have a few of you here in the International House today, a few of you joining us online. As always at the IS, we're gathering so we can discuss, talk, think about the most exciting things that are happening. This is our research haven where we really get together and remind ourselves what it is like to be an academic. A couple of housekeeping rules. For those of you joining us online, if you have any questions or comments during or after the presentation, please post them in the chat. We will make sure that we will have time in the end to discuss those. For those of you in the room, also feel free to ask questions or comments after the talk. There will also, of course, be an opportunity to talk during lunch. Mark is staying with us for lunch, of course. The presentation will be released as a podcast and also on our YouTube channel, but we will not be releasing questions and comments. So, that's kind of easy for us to discuss. I think that's it from me. And I would like to invite Justin to introduce Mark, as Justin has been the host for our research fellow.
Thank you, Ksenia. So my name is Justin Waring. I'm Dean of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Loughborough. And I'm just going to introduce Mark very briefly. And I suppose I'm going to go back to about 2015. And it's a long time ago. And I was reading some really interesting papers, particularly in public admin. There was another one in policy and politics that was dealing particularly with governmentality linked to governance. And there was this guy called Mark Bevir, which sounded really exotic and kind of French, which is actually Beaver. And I was like, oh, I wish I'd written this paper. This is when you read those papers and you go, shit, I wish I'd written that one. It's a really good paper. And then what was interesting is that about 3-4 months later, I got an email from Mark out of the blue inviting me to attend a workshop in Berkeley. And so I was absolutely gobsmacked on a number of levels. One, it was the person who I'd been reading about and reading their work, which was great. And then it was Berkeley, which is even better, which is like, I've never been there. It's a prestigious organisation. So I just thought, well, yeah, it's great. So I went away and prepared a paper, delivered a paper. And what struck me is that the workshops that Mark has organised over many years are really nice kind of round tables. So you normally get about 8 to 10 people, and over a day you talk about different ideas, typically on a theme. And I went away from that workshop thinking this is what academia should be like. Yeah, this is actually the best bit. And in fact, I stopped going to normal conferences because I was finding turning up for a 10-minute paper at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning when you got 2 other people there is really underwhelming. You get very little from it. And so I thanked Mark, gratefully, and I thought this was amazing and told him how amazing it was. And then basically for the next 10 years, I kept pitching ideas to him for other workshops. Would you like to do a workshop on health policy? Mark, being kind and generous, he goes, well, that sounds good. And then we've done public health, co-production, professions more recently. And so I just thought when I arrived here and I saw that we had this brilliant scheme, I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to reciprocate? Mark has been so generous to create, I think, an intellectual community in engagement with his ideas and his work around a variety of different topics for at least to kind of reciprocate and bring Mark here to kind of have that kind of similar engagement. And so what we did 2 weeks ago was invite a number of people who had also been out to Berkeley to come here for a 2-day workshop, similar format, to just discuss again how Mark's decentered theory of the decentered approach can be expanded and elaborated. And so it's just, I thought, a really nice thing to do. And so I'm really on board, and he's here with his wife, and it's just great that they get to spend some time in the UK. They're both Brits. And so it's great to have this opportunity and to hear from Mark. And we've kind of really squeezed the juice out of them. And this is about the 4th talk, I think, that you've done. So I hope it's been a great visit for you, both of you. And yeah, thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It has been a great visit, really nice. Thank you very much. It's been great to come back to Britain. My wife, many years ago, actually did a master's here at Loughborough. So it's also, we were together at the time, so I used to come up for weekends. So it's also been really nice to rediscover Loughborough. Anyway, I'll push on. So I realised, thinking about it, the word that keeps coming into my mind about this talk is it's a bit self-indulgent. So bear with me. By that, I mean that it's really an overview of my current thinking about social science. Some of it might get a bit complicated, but I don't think much of it is complicated. Because it's an overview, it covers quite a lot of ground, and I'm going to go through things quite quickly. But if there are things that you want to pick up on, we can do so in the discussion afterwards, or you can always email me. But it is basically an overview of how I currently see social science with some accounts of why. So, having owed up to that, I should begin by saying that for most of my career, what I've really been doing is writing about social science from a fairly philosophical perspective. So something like the philosophy of social science. And much of what I've been doing has been critical of more quantitative. I don't actually like the quantitative qualitative distinction. That will become clear today. More quantitative, more positivistic, more causal-based approaches. And instead, I've advocated for more interpretive and more historical approaches. And I still think that's right. But I've grown a bit bored of making that argument. I also think to some extent social science itself has changed while I've been making that argument. So there was a time when that argument, I think, was A, new and original and innovative, and B, something that other social scientists who were doing the sort of social science I didn't like were willing to address. And it seems to me that's not quite so true today, particularly in the US, but also I think here in Europe. There's been a growing turn to big data, statistical analysis, what we might think of as a new behavioralism, which is utterly divorced a lot of the time from mid-level theories or grander theories. And that means that the agenda has sort of changed. Arguments are less around theory and approaches and more around methods and analysis. And this has been brought home to me because I co-teach a course on the philosophy of social science with a colleague called Jason Wittenberg. And when we co-teach, he tends to grant me most of my philosophical assumptions, which I will return to in a moment, but insist on the importance of rigorous methods, by which he loosely means the kind of post-behavioral methods, and also because he thinks they and they alone are going to generate useful knowledge. So his claims are less based on ontology and epistemology and philosophy, and more based on the importance of rigorous methods for generating certain types of knowledge. So I think that illustrates how the terrain has sort of shifted from more theoretical debates to things that look like they're about methods, and I will suggest also in a way about ethics. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I hope in doing so, I'm also going to suggest at least some ways in which we might reconceive social science, political science, to make it more playful, more imaginative, and hopefully more fun. So that's roughly where I'm coming from and what I want to do. Although I'm hoping to move away from the philosophy, I thought I should briefly explain the philosophical background to what I'm doing. So much of what I've argued is for an anti-naturalist perspective on the social sciences, in contrast to the dominant naturalist perspective. What I mean by that is that most social science is naturalist in the sense that it believes the forms of explanation that we find in the natural sciences can be transferred and used in the social sciences. So they think the same sort of model or idea of causation that appears in natural science can be applied within the social sciences. They're looking for similar sorts of causes. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake. I'll unpack what I mean by what I'm about to say in a moment. I think that's a mistake because I think we explain human action in terms of the reasons of the actor. So if I say to you, why are you here today? You will give me a reason. That's what you will give me. And then I think those reasons are things that only make sense in the wider web of beliefs or wider web of reasons of the agent to whom we're speaking. So I think when we're engaging in the human sciences, our forms of explanation necessarily go through reasoning and agency. Whereas that's obviously not the case about the natural world. The reason this building is here is not something the building has a reason for. That, you know, if you said, what are you doing here, building? It couldn't give us a reason. If I said to the tree, why are you here, tree? Why are you growing? It can't give me a reason, right? So there's a difference between human action and the natural world, which I think appears in the sorts of explanations that Don made. I don't think it's a hard and fast distinction. Some parts of human life, such as my aging body, are largely biological and natural, but much of what most interests us as social sciences is not. It's about actions and the reasons behind them. The particular way in which I unpack that argument goes through something called holism, which is a fairly prominent / dominant strand in modern contemporary philosophy during my lifetime. There are two aspects of this holism that I want to draw to your attention because they will appear on and off in the later part of the talk. The first, which is actually probably going to be most important for the later part of the talk, is that it suggests all knowledge is provisional. So the idea of holism is that no single statement, no single proposition can be found to be true in and of itself. So the claim that this is a glass of water, which seems like a very straightforward proposition, is only true and false in the context of a wider web of beliefs, including our beliefs about what a glass is, what water is, the idea that it's appropriate to think of that as a glass of water rather than, say, a mirage, right? So we have all these background assumptions which are essential for fixing the references of the terms that appear in our propositions. And that means that the proposition itself only looks true or false in the context of that wider set of propositions, right? And that means that all knowledge is provisional because if we change radically our background set of propositions, something we currently hold true might not be true. I don't want to get into the philosophical arguments for that, but one way of thinking about its popularity is the extent to which Einstein sort of overturns Newton. So even things that look really, really true can be overturned if we come to see the world differently. If we come to think of time and space in different ways, that can change how we conceive even the fairly regular laws in mechanics. So even things in the natural sciences, in that case, are subject to this sort of holism. So the first point I want to say is holism leads to the idea that all knowledge is provisional. The second is that this holism, and this I think is what I used to emphasize when I was making my philosophical arguments, that sort of holism underlies the anti-naturalism I was talking about earlier. So if propositions are holistic, if we apply that to ourselves, a proposition I offer, a belief I offer, is true for me only in the context of my wider set of beliefs. So if, for instance, I vote, let's go say, I vote Labour because I believe in social justice, right? Which is the sort of proposition a social scientist might use to explain my behaviour. They might say, people who vote Labour tend to believe in social justice. They might want the social justice to fall out, but they might leave it in there. In my opinion, to make sense of that claim, you need to then say, well, what does the relevant person, in this case me, mean by social justice? So you have to unpack what I mean by social justice to understand how that would lead me to vote Labour. So in this case, presumably you would say something like, Mark believes in greater redistribution. But you can also imagine, for instance, someone who says, I vote Conservative because I believe in social justice. Well, how does that work? Maybe what they believe is something like that a just society is one where people are rewarded in accord with their effort and their merit, and they believe that that is best promoted through something like a more free market economy, less government intervention. So both of us could be appealing to social justice, but we're attaching different meanings to it. And you don't understand how our belief in social justice inspires our action unless you unpack the wider beliefs around it. So in that sense, then, holism also affects how we should think about intentionality and agency, and it feeds into the natural anti-naturalism argument. Okay, so that's the starting philosophy. And as I said earlier, today I want to turn to these two questions, which I think are in a way separate from the philosophical argument or can be detached from it. So one is the question about methods. What is rigorous knowledge? If a colleague says to me, fine, Mark, I grant you your philosophical arguments, but we really need to have rigorous methods in order to have rigorous knowledge. I want to ask, well, what looks like rigorous knowledge in this context? What should we consider rigorous knowledge to be? And the second is someone says, well, fine, I grant you for your philosophy, but we need these statistical big data sort of studies, other sorts of studies, because that's what useful knowledge is. Then what do we mean by useful knowledge? And these are the two questions I mainly want to address today. So I'm going to be assuming that the kind of philosophy I hold or held is broadly true. And I'm going to be asking, what does that mean about how we should think about rigorous knowledge or methods, and then useful knowledge or ethics? So let's start with methods. What does my philosophy suggest we should say or think about what methods are? Well, I think the first thing to say is that a method is really just a technique for gathering or analysing information. There's a lot of confusion around this because a lot of social scientists partly, in my opinion, because they're not very philosophically sophisticated and don't have any philosophical training, are inclined to muddle methods with approaches. So they're inclined, notice I sort of did this a bit earlier, they're inclined to say behavioralism is about statistical analysis, or they're going to say something like rational choice is tied to formal modeling. Right? So the method, the way in which you get or analyze data, is seen as somehow tied to an approach, but clearly it isn't. Right? Clearly you could adopt that method whilst being an interpretivist, or so I think. And clearly, likewise, someone who believes heavily in the importance of statistical data could nonetheless think, you know what, I'm going to do a bit of ethnography just to see if that passes out what I'm finding in the statistical data. So clearly there's a sense in which these methods, they're not actually logically tied to the approaches that they tend to go with in the way that most commentators suggest. Instead, these methods are just techniques for gathering and analysing information. Moreover, most of these techniques are valid. No one in their right, well, I don't think anyone in their right mind is going to suggest that something like a regression analysis doesn't provide you with the statistical information that people who advocate regression analysis say it provides. They do. So these techniques are valid, just like multiplication is a valid technique. They're just ways of getting at information. Of course, they could be challenged. You could say, I think that's logically a mistake. It's not a valid form of induction, or it's not a valid form of deduction. But we can do that with all methods in principle, right? So in principle, all these different sorts of methods are valid as ways of generating data or analysing the data that you've generated. And in that sense, I think all philosophical perspectives are what we might call philosophically neutral, right? There's no logical reason why a philosophical perspective requires you to adopt a particular method. It might lead you to favour some methods over others for reasons I'll come to in a moment, but it doesn't require you to adopt certain methods. A second implication of how we should think about methods is that causal analysis, which at the moment seems to be the main trend in much of the social sciences, certainly in most policy and political science fields, causal analysis is actually a myth, right? Because causal analysis is just a way of finding patterns in the data. That's all you're actually finding. If you trace back statistical relationships between things, all you're doing is revealing statistical patterns in the data. You're not establishing a cause behind what is lying there. So you can regard it as a particularly rigorous way of identifying patterns in the data, but it's not actually a way of isolating a cause. Why not? Think back to my argument about holism. What would count as a cause in this context is going to depend on your wider beliefs about what causes human action. So somebody finds a statistical pattern whereby, say, voting Labour is tied to being working class. That might be an interesting statistical pattern, but I wouldn't identify it as a cause because my wider web of beliefs requires that the cause be the agent's reasoning. So it's only a cause if you believe that human behaviour is caused irrespective of people's reasoning. Right? So the causal analysis that we have is a way of fixing and finding patterns within data, but it's not a way of actually finding causes in the way that it's sometimes presented. So I think the sort of philosophies that I advocate, interpretive philosophical perspectives, are largely agnostic over techniques, but they have an input into how we think about explanations. In this case, the fact that I'm a holist and therefore that I think that, and most interpretivists are holists, and most interpretivists think that people act for reasons of their own, and they think that those reasons are things that fit together into larger webs of belief, all that implies a favouring a particular form of explanation of human behaviour, but it doesn't require us to adopt a particular method. From this perspective, then, we have good grounds to question current ideals of rigour. So let's just flip back for a moment. You will see that I'm interested here in what is rigorous knowledge. And I've suggested that methods are basically neutral ways of getting data. And what's really at stake in the method you adopt is less whether or not the method is valid as a way of getting or analysing data than whether or not the method is tied to a suitable concept of explanation, right? And that means that we should think about rigour less in terms of how rigorous a method is statistically, and more in terms of whether the method is appropriate for the sorts of explanations we want to offer. Right? So if, for instance, let's imagine, just to be facetious almost for a moment, let's imagine that we want an explanation for why Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. It would seem ridiculously inappropriate to come up with some sort of statistical analysis about the qualities of playwrights in Elizabethan England and say people with these qualities were bound to write The Tempest. That seems like an obviously inappropriate explanation, right? Whereas if we want to know something more like how many people turn right when they first go into a supermarket, whether they are aware that that's what they're doing or not, then to say X% do, a statistical analysis looks more appropriate. So what we're doing when we're thinking about the appropriateness of a method for a particular study is we're saying, is this appropriate as a method to answer the particular question that we're now trying to address? Instead of seeing rigor as something that applies to the method and the method alone, we should see rigor as something that applies to the relationship between the method and the sort of explanation we want to give of the sort of topic we are addressing. So rigor is not something that you can attach to a method and say, this method is more rigorous, this method is less rigorous. Instead, you have to say, is this study rigorous? Or is that study rigorous? And the way you would answer that question is by saying, does it adopt a method that is appropriate to the style of explanation it's adopting? And is that style of explanation appropriate to the object that is being studied? Right? And I think that's a really, really important point, because I have a profound worry, which ties into my hope that this in some ways is a way of making social science more interesting and more fun. I have a profound worry that the pursuit of rigor, understood as merely rigorous method outside of context, leads to dull, unimaginative and boring social science, because it more or less forces people to only undertake studies that are subject to the appropriate method that is deemed to be rigorous. So you get all sorts of studies, and there are way too many such studies on things like, do voters tend to vote for taller candidates? Do voters tend to vote for more attractive candidates, which in the end are just incredibly boring and facile? The answers in both cases, I'm sure, are yes, but it's not very interesting. And it doesn't tell us much about human life, about societies, about how they operate, about what's going on, about broader ideas. Some broader ideas, typically things like the irrationality of human behaviour, are no doubt underlying those questions, but they're not brought to the fore. They're not treated as ideas that we can debate and discuss. Instead, they're pushed to one side, and we just get a constant stream of dull, myopic studies. I think, for what it's worth, this is tied to, or related to, the extent to which big books in the social science are increasingly being displaced by articles. The focus stands of social science research is on particular myopic little studies and not on broader debates. And I personally think that's a sad shift that's gone on in my lifetime. So what then should we do about this? How should we redescribe methods, given firstly that rigor is largely illusory, and second that alternative methods may be more appropriate, insightful and fun than those currently dominate? Well, if you believe this, which obviously I do because it's what I've been arguing, I think you have two possible rhetorical strategies. The first is that you can expand the range of our existing concepts, our existing methodological concepts, to cover alternative methods. So, for instance, you might insist that the sort of material that someone engaged in an ethnographic study generates counts as data. So what you would be doing there is trying to say, look, certainly statistical analysis generates data, but we too have data. We doing these alternative methods, we also have data. So that would be a way of expanding the existing dominant concepts in order to cover a broader range of methods. The second, I have to say, that's a very common strategy. The first strategy is really common, it totally dominates. But I want to point out there's a second strategy. And the second strategy is to change our existing concepts so that they better reflect a greater variety of methods. So to reject the concept of data for, say, evidence, which is a much broader term. I prefer the second strategy. I prefer the second strategy because, having explored both strategies, particularly the first one, I find that the first one means that interpretive social scientists such as myself are constantly on the defensive. Because if you say this is data, you're suggesting a certain thing about it. You're almost suggesting that the data is numerical. So you're constantly on the defensive about the nature of your data. You're constantly having to justify the fact that your data doesn't quite look like our paradigm of data. Whereas I think if we changed the concepts, we would be on a more level playing field. So I want to change the way in which we think about these concepts. And here's what I want to do. These are our existing concepts. These are my alternatives. I'll go through them briefly, but it will be very brief. It will be very brief because I actually don't think much is at stake in the particular concepts that are, or words, if you like, that I offer. I think the key point is that we should be replacing our current narrow concepts with broader ones. Which words we use, I don't think matters much. So these are just the ones I've picked. So whereas currently we're inclined to talk about methods, which is what I've been doing throughout this talk, I think we should talk about toolkit, which seems to me a broader way. It gets us away from the very idea of methods. And it suggests that we have loads of tools. And if you attach the word kit to it, it suggests a variety, which you get out what? For doing their job. So if I want, my wife will tell you I'm so impractical around the house that I will probably get this completely wrong. But if I want to tighten a screw, I'm going to use a spanner, right? I'm not going to get out a sledgehammer. Whereas if I want to knock something down, I'm going to get out a sledgehammer and not a spanner. So what tool you want from your toolkit depends upon the task before you, which goes with what I was saying earlier about how appropriate the method is, depends upon what it is you're trying to explain and how you're trying to explain it. And I think, therefore, we should see ourselves less as researchers, more as bricoleurs. We should replace the idea of a hypothesis, which again suggests a formal thing that is going to be rigorously tested with a plausible conjecture, because notice a hypothesis is not going to be proved. That follows from my suggestion that all knowledge is provisional, right? So the hypothesis at the end is still going to remain a conjecture. So why not call it that, a plausible conjecture? Move, as I suggested earlier, from data to evidence. Correlation, notice I've already been doing this in the talk. We should stop talking about correlations. We should talk about patterns. That's what you're actually finding. And just as a statistical analysis might reveal a pattern in the data, so might a more qualitative or interpretive analysis reveal a pattern. We should definitely drop the idea of structure, which leads to ridiculously over-formal explanations, and adopt the idea of practice. We could arguably give up the idea of explanation, which again suggests a very formal process, and instead adopt the idea of explication. And relatedly, we give up the idea of theory, which tends to suggest a fairly formal theory, and instead adopt an idea of narrative. So what we're doing is telling our story about whatever evidence we happen to have. All of these ideas, I think, are covered by these ones. So I think all the naturalist concepts are covered by the anti-naturalist one. It's just the anti-naturalist one broadens it out to provide a more welcoming concept under which to adopt a wider range of methods and approaches to how you want to set about going about social science. And I think this then opens up the idea that what we should be thinking about is not just what method to adopt, but also what genre we want to use. Recall that the last slide ended by suggesting we switch idea from explanation to narrative. So we're actually telling stories. Of course we're telling stories. We think the stories are true, but that's what they are, because they're just conjectures, because all our knowledge is provisional. So we're always, in that sense, sort of telling stories. We're not simply relating facts. And that one way of then thinking about the stories we tell is what genre were we adopting? How are we narrating these? And this is where I start to, again, want to suggest that this is a way of opening up social science to make it more fun. Because I think we can imagine different genres in which we tell these stories, the stories we want to tell about the political world, about the social world. I have a slight problem with the word genre, because genre is often used in a way that I would regard as reified, as though you're going to give a formal definition of the genre and something that fits under that genre as an example of it. And I really don't want to do that. Instead, I just want to get across a sense that there are a wide range of varieties. There's a wide variety of stories that we can tell in different ways about the political and social world, all of which are informative, all of which are interesting, and all of which can be inspiring and worth discussing. So some examples: biography and autobiography, ethnography and participant observation, history or genealogy, even literature and text. You can imagine novels that tell us interesting things about politics or about society life. And I'm going to throw myth up there, which I will come back to in a moment. Right? We could tell myths. To some extent, I don't think there's a lot new here. So we've always had, in political science or in social science, we've always had biographies. Think of biographies of Thatcher, biographies of Blair, biographies of Trump. You know, as soon as someone becomes a powerful politician, someone's going to be writing a biography of them. There've always been ethnographies. There've also been participant ethnographies, where someone simply presents, say, their diaries or an edited version of their diaries. So we have all these things around us, these genres. We could invent others. They all exist. The problem is, at the moment, they're devalued. At the moment, the insistence on thinking about methods from a more post-behavioralist way means that all these genres are devalued as ways of understanding politics, as ways of understanding administration, as ways of understanding society. So really what I'm doing in drawing attention to them is not trying to advocate something new, but rather get us away from the tyranny of rigor, which forces us to adopt certain sorts of approaches and engage in certain sorts of studies, and instead suggest we can engage in all these different ones. So what then about my second question? What about ethics? So, as I suggested earlier, one of the reasons we might, or post-behavioralists might favour more statistical or more rigorous knowledge is they might feel it's more useful. Right? So they might feel that if you're trying to guide public policy, to understand Mark's particular reasons for voting this way or engaging in that way isn't very interesting. Whereas if we have a massive database which tells us about the percentage of people who do X or Y under certain circumstances, that's a much better basis on which to ground public policy. And I don't necessarily entirely disagree with that under some contexts, but I do want to point out that it tends to elide an important issue. So if you're going to say that post-behavioralist knowledge or statistical analysis generate more useful knowledge, you need to define what you mean by useful, which virtually never happens. And in that context, useful is obviously an ethical concept, because use is something like useful for us as in makes the world a better place. The person I co-teach with, who I mentioned earlier, tends to make the argument, or has made the argument, by saying, imagine that this sort of statistical knowledge could help us to cure AIDS in Africa. You wouldn't object to it, would you? The answer to which is obviously no, I wouldn't, right? Assuming that it could. So you can see just in that example how there's a hidden sense of what useful is. Useful is about improving the world. But if something's going to improve the world, you need a criteria for what a better world is. And that's not something social science can tell you. There has to be an ethical position there. Loosely, I think most of us would say a world in which people are what? Happier, securer, safer, more able to get on with their lives without being subjected to horrible violence or bigotry looks like a better world. But all of those are ethical claims that need to be unpacked and aren't. So I think at the moment, the claim that some forms of knowledge provide more useful knowledge is at best a fairly empty rhetorical claim that needs to be spelled out. But putting that aside, I want to offer some arguments that suggest the idea that post-behavioral statistical causal analysis offers more useful knowledge is an idea we should be deeply skeptical of. And the first argument I want to make is that we should be wary of the dangers of a false rigor. So I've already suggested that the rigor of these studies is in some sense illusory. What it tends to do is to assume that when you find the data, you've got a correlation, and the correlation is a cause, and that's fixed in stone. And that's obviously not true from my perspective, because it's not, because how people will act will depend on their reasons. So you can imagine two people who say, I stand in identical social relationships to one another, but nonetheless hold different beliefs which lead them to behave in different ways. So if you actually want to understand their behavior, you need to understand their reasoning, not just their social location, social situation. And I think that this rigor, this pursuit of rigor and the suggestion, the ultimate suggestion the social sciences are offering knowledge as secure as the sciences, leads to a false sense of security that policies based on this knowledge, this causal analysis, will work as intended or as proposed. So somebody can say to you something like, go for a historical example. If somebody says to you, markets are inherently efficient, or networks will always build trust, and then they offer you a causal model of why this is so, a statistical analysis of why it's so, then as a policymaker, you might think, if I introduce markets, I'm necessarily going to get a more efficient world. Or you might think, if I can build networks between these different agencies, I'm necessarily going to get greater trust, right? So the very idea that what we're getting is a fixed causal relationship encourages an over-optimism about the success of public policies. And in my opinion, that over-optimism about the success of public policies leads to a string of policy failures, because nobody is actually consulting with the targets of the policy. No one is going out and asking people, how might you react if we introduce this policy? What impact do you think this policy will have on how you behave? No one is consulting the citizens who will be impacted on the policy. Instead, they're assuming that the expertise is straightforwardly correct. So I think if we think about rigor as in some sense generating useful knowledge, we're likely to be, or traditional post-behavioralist causal analysis like rigor, as generating useful knowledge, we're likely to perpetuate a cycle of policy failure in which scientism leads to overconfidence in expert advice, which leads to policies that don't work as intended, which leads to another round of reforms, and so on and so on and so on. And I guess I'm blaming social science for a cycle of policy failure that I think we've been into, certainly in public sector reform, I think has been going on for most of my adult life. And then the other thing I want to say, which is a more ethical comment, that's a sort of ethical consideration in my broad sense of ethics, but the other is that I think we should be wary of the dangers of objectification. So even if we grant that these forms of knowledge, which treat people as bound to behave in a certain way because of certain properties they have, or just because of a universal rationality, if we treat people in that way, we're effectively objectifying. So we're saying Mark is bound to behave in the way that he does because what? Because he's an academic, because he was born in London, because whatever you like to imagine, because he's from this class or that class, this gender or that gender, whatever criteria a social scientist might use, right? Then you're going to say what you're effectively doing is objectifying me. So you're effectively saying the person you're looking at, the people you're looking at are objects who are bound to behave in this way because of the nature of themselves as an object. And you're removing the idea that how they act depends on their own subjectivity, that is their own reasoning and their own agency. That's the key move that the naturalists make. They treat the social world as objectified. So by definition, that's what's going to go on. And I think that naturalism has a cost. I think it has a string of costs. But the first is, I think it constantly encourages us to lose sight of the fact that other people are agents. In doing so, it also leads us to lose a certain degree of empathy for other people, because instead of trying to imagine ourselves into their position and think, why are they acting as they are, it encourages us to just treat them as objects that we perhaps deplore, right? So if you're on the left, maybe you deplore the right rather than thinking, well, what are their reasons for behaving like this? If you're on the right, you maybe deplore the left instead of thinking, well, what are their reasons for acting like this? So I think when we objectify people, we lose sight of the fact that they're agents. We tend to become less empathetic. We tend to underestimate the need for participation and democracy as ways of coming to terms with their agency, respecting it, but also understanding how it's likely to play out in a particular situation. And instead we get trapped into the sort of technocracy that provides us with the false rigor. So I think even if there are occasions when it is the case that post-behavioural causal analysis generates knowledge that is helpful in policy making, if we treat that as a blanket statement, we will go wildly awry. Instead, we need to constantly remind ourselves that people are agents who should be treated as such, and say, even though that is so, under certain circumstances, we might benefit from treating this sort of data as revealing these sorts of patterns. Notice that how I'm using words from my earlier slide. This sort of data is generating these sorts of patterns, which might lead us to make these plausible conjectures, which might lead us to try and experiment with this sort of policy. Right? And I'm all for that, but it's in that context that we should make use of the sort of knowledge that causal analysis does indeed offer us, or the sort of studies it offers us. So I did say I'll try and turn a bit to myths, and I will. So, and this is moving into the bit where I hope I'm going to suggest a way of making social science more imaginative and perhaps more fun. So coming back to the idea that because everything is uncertain, right, holism means that all knowledge is provisional. What that means is that we're always dealing with webs of belief. What I've tried to do in a ridiculously short time is walk you through my web of belief and my particular research program, which I hope I've given you a sense of how it blends theory, technique, and topic. So it blends theory, which is the kind of philosophy I was looking at, the interpretive ideas, the holism, with technique, my approach to methods, my faith that some methods are typically going to be more useful than others for at least understanding people's subjective reasons for doing things, and why I would favour some topics over others. Right? But that's what it is. It's my research program, and there will be rival research programs which fit together at least as well. And that means that social science is always going to be about comparing these rival research programs. There's never going to be one perspective which we can say, oh, this is definitely true. If there was, then my holism would be wrong. Instead, there's always going to be rival research programs, what we might call my interpretive one, or interpretive ones more generally, a rational choice one, a post-behavioralist one. There are always going to be these different research programs. And once we see that, we open up a space for thinking about how are we going to compare these rival research programs? How are we going to decide which works better? And I'm going to draw attention to two kind of things we can do which broaden social science to address just that question. The first is we can engage in critique and unmasking. So we can tell stories about these rival approaches. If I want to, say, challenge rational choice theory, I can tell a story about its rise. If I were to tell you a story about its rise, which I'm obviously not going to do now, it will be one that tied it to the need of America to develop an ideology suited to the Cold War, extreme funding for a range of research programs around particular ideas of choice and decision making and decision theory coming out of the US government and the RAND Corporation, and the way in which those help to extend neoclassical economics into a more general program of study of the social sciences. That's quite a critical perspective on rational choice theory. It doesn't rule it out, but it's kind of moving towards a critique. I would also want to tell a story about where my own interpretive views come from. So I would talk about the persistence of certain philosophical strands which underlie what I was getting about. Notice that's quite an interesting thing. If you want to justify your approach, you need to be able to narrate where it's come from, which is quite an interesting idea. How exactly would, say, rational choice do that? If rational choice is a product of actors acting what? To promote their own utility function understood as what? Self-interested desires. That doesn't give us much reason to believe in it, does it? Same might apply to most forms of institutionalism. If an institutionalist was to narrate the rise of institutionalism, they would presumably have to do so by saying it arose because a bunch of social scientists followed norms. Well, that doesn't seem like a good reason to believe in it. Whereas an interpretivist is on strong ground here because they can say, well, interpretivism arose for these reasons, which are what the agent acted on. So you can embed your own assumptions, the assumptions of your approach, into the narratives you're telling about your approach and others. And that's a way of critiquing and unmasking different ones. You can also tie it into assumptions and speculative hypotheses. Let's be nicer to rational choice for a moment. Rational choice theorists could tie what they're doing into studies in evolutionary biology, which suggests that all animals act in fairly self-interested ways, and that you can model all sorts of animal behavior on that basis. That's obviously a massive thing for rational choice to lean into, but it's not something you can prove. So at these points, as you get into these broader assumptions and these critiques and these unmaskings, what we're doing is taking social science into a world of myth, by which I mean we're explicitly engaging in things that are uncertain. We're explicitly offering imaginative, speculative hypotheses to link our ideas together and make them fit together better. And I think offering those sorts of linked hypotheses in that way and exploring ideas, big, bold ideas, that tie our particular studies into approaches in social science, that compare different approaches in social science, and that link the approaches in social science to wider philosophical, scientific, and other agendas, is actually the most interesting part of being a scholar and an intellectual rather than, say, a policy advisor. Because that's where you're actually engaged in intellectual exploration of the underlying issues that I think should interest us most. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. A quick reminder about how to stay connected. You can find us on Blue Sky, LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can also watch the presentations on YouTube. The podcast is available on all the major platforms. Please download, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you next time.